Okay, so today we're going to be starting with research methods. So we're going to officially start the chapter. Basically, today all we're going to do is just cover the first spread, which is spread 1A. Now, research methods shouldn't be completely new to any of us. If you're doing any of the other sciences, you would obviously have already learned about research methods. Again, because you guys, most of you are in year 12, obviously the topics and the key skills that you do cover this year will be the same that you covered last year. So this year should be more of a recap rather than completely learning from scratch again. Okay. Obviously, research methods is a really important topic, not only because it can be quite boring and a lot of students neglect it, but because it does form some of the difficult questions in the exam. Okay, so that's basically why we need to make sure we are all good with the basic concept. It's not that hard as long as you just give it some attention. Okay, so that's the main thing to remember. It's not challenging. It can be confusing, but it's not actually hard. So we just have to go in with the mindset that research methods is not bad and it's not all that bad. And then we can probably understand it better. So guys, today all we're going to do is cover spread 1A, which is really covering the basics of research methods, which is aims, hypotheses, and variables. Okay. So before we look at that, we just have to understand that every experiment or every psychological study, every research investigation we do in psychology or in any of the sciences uses the scientific method. The scientific method is basically this idea that we observe something happening and then we form our own hypothesis or our own prediction about how two variables might be related. We then perform an experiment. We get some results or we get some data. And from those results or data, we analyze that. We try to understand what the results mean. Then we report the findings and then we invite others to reproduce the results. So your book really has a nice, cute way of showing this. Obviously the baby sees the lemons and then makes an observation that, oh, those lemons look interesting. So then they form a hypothesis about maybe the taste of the lemons and how it might make them feel. Okay, they might think that maybe eating lemons will make them feel happy. So then they perform the experiment of actually eating the lemons, okay? Obviously, we know lemons are really sour, so the baby kind of is very upset by the taste. Okay, they then report the findings that, oh my God, lemons are actually not yummy. They don't make you feel happy. They're actually quite disgusting. And then they can invite others, like other babies, to reproduce the results by doing the same thing, by eating the lemon and then analyzing their response or their reaction to that. Okay, so that's the scientific method and it's the basic idea behind every experiment. Now, we're not going to ask you to memorize these steps, but these steps should be in your basic general knowledge. Okay, so that means that you should understand that before any experiment is done, we have to form a hypothesis, we have to do an experiment, we have to get the results, and then we have to analyze the results. And if other people are then interested in our experiment, they can actually then redo our experiment or replicate our experiment. Okay, that's the basic idea, but nothing to memorize on this slide per se. Okay, then we move into aims and hypotheses. So whenever we're doing a research study or experiment, we have to be able to understand what is the purpose of what we're doing, what are we actually trying to achieve, okay? An aim is a brief statement which outlines the purpose of the study. Usually, if you remember from last year, the aim usually starts with the words to investigate, okay? So if I can find my annotation box. So usually the aim would be something like, let's say I'm doing a study on the effect of red cordial and how it affects hyperactivity, okay? So I would say to investigate the effect of IV, which in our example is red cordial, on hyperactivity levels in children. You don't even need to mention the in children part. That's the DV. Okay, so that's simply what the aim is. The aim is usually just worth 1 mark or 2 marks if we were to ask you the aim of a research scenario. Usually starts with to investigate the effect of IV on DV. That's about it. The hypothesis, we all know, we're more familiar with the hypothesis. It's a testable prediction. We know it's obviously a lot longer than the aim because it involves 5 main components, 5 main components. And we use the abbreviation IPOD-C to remember them. So IPOD-C stood for IV, population, operationalizing both the IV-DV, the statement of the simple DV, and the control group. So those are our 5 components we include. And usually our hypotheses are normally worth 3 marks. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Another example here, if a psychologist was interested in studying the research question of does handwriting notes lead to increased SAC marks, the aim of the study would be to investigate or to determine the impact of handwriting notes, which is the IV, on an individual SAC marks, which is the DV. A possible hypothesis could be that it was hypothesized that VCE students who handwrote their psychology notes would achieve higher SAC marks compared to VCE students who did not handwrite their notes. Now, in this hypothesis, you can see that the variables haven't been operationalized. But again, for this reason, because it's just a hypothesis, it's okay. If we ask you for a research hypothesis, you must operationalize those variables, okay? Almost always VCAA and we always tend to ask you for the research hypothesis, okay? Because that's what is expected at year 12 level there. Last year when you guys were in year 11 or year 10, a lot of you, a lot of the time, we didn't always ask you for a research hypothesis. We didn't always expect you to operationalize the variables, but at year 12 level, if there is information about how the variables have been measured, then yes, you must operationalize them in your hypothesis then. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now, experimental research, again, this is just a really introductory topic, but we know what an experiment is. We know that an experiment is one way of conducting research, okay? It's a commonly used research method. Now, in spread 1B that we'll cover on Friday, we're going to look at the different types of ways we can collect information, because we know it's not just about an experiment, but we can also use, for example, case studies. We can also use observational studies. We can also use interviews, okay? There's so many ways we can collect information. We'll learn about that on Friday, but today we're just looking at experiments, okay? We know that an experiment assesses or investigates a cause-effect relationship between variables, okay? What does that mean? That means that the, sorry, let me just let these people in. That means that the cause, oops, sorry, cause equals to the IV and the effect equals to the DV. Okay, that's what we mean by cause-effect relationship. We're understanding the relationship between the IV and the DV. So how does the IV specifically affect or impact the DV there? Under controlled conditions. So what do we mean by controlled conditions? Basically, we mean conditions that we as the experimenter or we as the researcher can manipulate. So the most common one would be a lab. Remember when we studied the strange situation last year with the kid and the mom and the stranger in the room and how the stranger leaves the room? That would basically be an example of, you know, a controlled situation. So a lab or a room, something that can be easily controlled there. So that's basically looking at our controlled condition there. Okay, then we look at this other idea of, what's it called? The fact that every experiment that we do involves the manipulation of one variable and how it affects another variable. So what we usually say is that whenever we manipulate the IV, that will almost always cause a change in the DV, okay? So that's the basic idea there. Okay, okay, just give me 1 second. Yeah. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense so far. So again, it's just a recap of last year, so don't stress too much at this point. Then we look at our variables. Okay, so our variables, we know that there are 2 main variables we use in an experiment, as in the actual experiment, that are actually supposed to be there. And those are called the independent variable and the dependent variable. What do we mean by supposed to be there? Well, we can have variables in a study that are unwanted, okay? And last year, if you remember, we called them extraneous and potential confounding. The wanted variables, the ones that we want to be there, the ones we expect to be there, are called the independent variable and the dependent variable. Last year, you would remember we used the example of the red cordial and how if we do an experiment on how red cordial affects hyperactivity levels in children, then the red cordial is what we're manipulating, because obviously I can manipulate or vary that variable in some way. Manipulate or vary means that I can give these kids 200 mils of cordial. Okay, I can choose the measurement there. I can choose how I manipulate that variable. I could give them 2 glasses of cordial, which is 500 mils. Okay, if I want, I can literally give them the whole bottle. I can give them 1 liter of cordial. Okay, I can make them 1 liter of cordial if I want to. Obviously, that's because as the experimenter, I have the right to manipulate that variable as I see fit. Okay. The dependent variable is the variable we're measuring for change. So when this red cordial goes into the systems of these kids and they drink it up, what then happens to their behavior? I'm measuring their behavior to see if there's a change. In this specific example, the change will be how hyperactive they become or whether their behavior changes at all. Okay, we know that sometimes we don't expect that every IV will cause a change in the DV. Sometimes our hypotheses are not supported. Okay, even though we make a prediction, sometimes our behavior or the results or the dependent variable, it doesn't actually show any change at all. And remember, guys, last year as well, I mentioned this DV, when we say dependent variable, it's really confusing, but you need to remember dependent variable is just our DV, and our DV are just the results. Okay, and that our results are simply the behavior that we're observing. Okay, the behavior or the phenomena or the whatever we're observing, behavior or phenomena. I kind of type phenomena we're observing. Okay, that's the basic idea. So don't get confused. So that's the IV and DV. Now, in your book, they have a nice little analogy for this. They say that you can look at the IV and DV as kind of being like a TV and the antenna. So if you remember back in the old days, they used to have TVs with antennas on them, okay? And like you'd have to kind of like, you know, move the antenna in a way that every time you move the antenna, the TV would either become more clear or it would become like really unclear and all that static, the black and white static would show up. Okay, so you can remember how the IV affects the DV by remembering the memory tip IV, DV, TV. So you remember that picture of the TV in your head. You remember that the IV is right at the top. Okay, that's the antenna. And you remember that every time you move that antenna, you move that IV or you manipulate or change the IV, what you see on the TV screen, which is represented as the DV, is also going to change. Okay, so that's just to show you that it's always the IV that makes a change in the DV, not the other way around. Okay. Okay, so we will do a few scenarios today as well to really understand the concept of IV and DV. Then we look at our research hypothesis. So again, this shouldn't be completely new to anyone. And we did do this last year. I'm going to add a C here. And I did add this last year on the board as well. There should be another little variable here, which is control group. The reason I'm adding this in is that at the beginning, we used to assume that students would just remember the control group, but then we realized that most students actually forgot the control group. So when we add it into the memory tip, it means that you won't forget it, because if you say iPod C, you're like, oh, what's the C? So then obviously you remember to include the control group. So guys, the research hypothesis again is just a statement about what you predict is going to happen in terms of your IV, DV, and your results. Okay, so it's a prediction, in other words. It involves the IV, so that's where the I comes from, the P, which is the population, not the sample. You're never going to say something like, it is hypothesized that 26 year 12 psychology students from Altacor College, la la la. That's too specific. That's not the population now, that's the sample. Okay, so in your hypothesis, there should never be, sorry, let me bring up a little box. Never write the quantity of participants in the hypothesis. The minute you mention the quantity of participants or the amount, or say 52 year 12 students, that becomes a sample. That doesn't become the population. The population is always stated generally. So rather than saying 52 year 12 students, you would just simply say year 12 students. That's it. You wouldn't mention the number. You wouldn't mention any other details about them, where they're from, which school they're from, what subject they're doing, just year 12 students. That's enough. Okay. Then we operationalize variables, and this is talking about how variables are measured in the study. We mention what the DV is, and then we say compared to participants who were not exposed to the IV. Okay, so that's the control group there. And we'll look at a few examples of this. We'll do some together, and I'll get you to do some as well in the next period when you're in the offline. Okay, so we already learned last year what operationalizing variables means. It sounds a lot difficult than it is, but it actually just means how we're measuring the IV, or how we're manipulating the IV, or how we're measuring the DV. With operationalizing variables, there can be different ways we operationalize variables. So if I'm doing a study to measure the effect of drinking green tea every day on weight loss, green tea is obviously my IV, correct? Let me just maybe put that into a little text box so we can understand it better. Okay, so in that case, green tea would be my IV and weight loss would be my DV. Okay, this is very simple. The simple IV, simple DV, not operationalized. Now, obviously, if I'm going to operationalize that IV, I'm just going to op. You know, I could basically say I'm giving my participants each 250 mils of green tea, each to drink each evening. Okay, that could be how I'm operationalizing variable. If someone else decides to do this study, they might say that, no, I want to do it differently. I want to give my participants 500 mils of green tea. And rather than drinking it each evening, I'm going to get them to drink it each morning. Okay, so you can see that it's the same basic IV, but the way we're measuring that IV is different. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Same thing with weight loss. Okay, if we operationalize weight loss, we could operationalize it by amount of kilograms lost, and we're using a weighing scale to kind of measure that. However, we also know that weight loss is not just about the number on the scale. It can also be about how many inches you've lost from your waist, or how many how much more slim or skinnier your stomach has become. Okay, so obviously we can maybe look at something like waist circumference. Okay, and we can measure this in centimeters using a tape measure. Okay, so this is basically showing you that it's the same basic DV of weight loss, but the ways that we operationalize or measure that variable can be different depending on what we are doing as the experimenter in our specific research study. So that's simply what operationalizing is. A lot of the time you will be given information about how the variable is measured in your research scenario. So you will not be expected to make it up. So yeah, you don't need to worry. All you're doing is looking for that information in the scenario and literally just kind of pasting it into your response there, or just adding that into your response. So yeah, that's basically what we talk about when we talk about operationalizing of the variables there. I think this slide is copied again. Must be a mistake. So anyway, we'll skip that. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end of this PowerPoint, just differentiating between an aim hypothesis, IV, DV. So again, this is another example. So the research question was, does drinking coffee affect the levels of concentration? So obviously we can see, we have to think about what's the variable we're manipulating and what's the thing that we're measuring for change. Okay, what's the behavior? A lot of the times the DV is a behavior. So you can think of it like that. Okay, obviously if we look at drinking coffee levels of concentration, what are we measuring for change? You could say, well, Miss, drinking coffee is a behavior as well. How can that not be the DV? Drinking coffee is a behavior, but think about the fact that how would we measure coffee for change? Coffee is just a substance, right? We can't measure that for change. What we can measure is the person's response to that coffee. And in this case, the person's response is looking at the concentration. Okay, so that's why the DV would be the concentration levels, and the IV would be whether participants drink coffee or whether they consume caffeine or do not consume caffeine. Okay, the aim would be to establish, to investigate, to determine, whatever, any of those words you can use, a relationship between caffeine consumption and increased levels of concentration. And this is the simple hypothesis. It hasn't been operationalized. It just says it was hypothesized that participants who consume caffeine will display higher levels of concentration than participants who don't. Okay, that might seem really simple, but honestly, guys, when you look at some of the hypotheses that some students write in the exams, it's very simple, but they still get full marks for it. Okay, I mean, honestly, like I'm going to be quite honest, like I can overcomplicate things at times, especially because you know, like I tend to make things like the hypothesis might be quite long, but as I always tell you, you could write a hypothesis that's still going to get full marks, but it might be shorter in terms of its length. Okay, so again, that's a basic hypothesis. It's not operationalized, but it would get you the marks there. Okay, that covers all the basic ideas there. So then we go to obviously looking at some examples. These are again all taken from your book. Just put them in the slide just for convenience, I guess. You can see that's the hypothesis and how how we're basically unpacking or dissecting each of those different components. So that's the hypothesis. It was hypothesized that people who meditate may report lower levels of stress. So obviously the independent variable would be meditation. The operationalized variable might be the number of minutes people spend meditating per week. The dependent variable would be what kind of stress levels they report. And then specifically how we measured that is maybe on a scale of 1 to 10. So we asked them on a scale of 1 to 10, how stressed do you feel, blah, blah, blah. Another nice example is it was hypothesized that people who have more fresh air are more motivated to complete their homework. Okay, and this is really a nice example thinking about COVID now and how a lot of us are really confined to our houses. So does having more fresh air motivate you to complete your homework? So obviously the independent variable would be exposure to fresh air. That's the cause. The effect of being exposed to fresh air is the DV. So that's the effect. So is your motivation to complete homework increasing or decreasing? Okay. And that's the basic idea. So that's just a few examples there to show you a hypothesis and how you can then take an IV and DV out of that and how you could possibly measure that IV and DV as well.
Miss?
Yes?
During SACs or exams, is it always we got to conduct this kind of stuff based on a case study?
Yes, always you will be answering questions in terms of a case study. If you are asked to design your own experiment, you would be given all the information to do that. So you would be given what the variables are, and you just have to kind of put that information together. Yeah, so we would never ask you in a SAC to do that. We are going to run our own experiment in class. That's going to be our main SAC for this outcome, which is the poster SAC. But we're going to be doing that as a class. So it's not going to be like you doing that on your own. Yeah. So yeah, when we're looking at an example, I think we went through this example last year as well, the meditation on sleep quality for year 10 students. So you can know that the simple IV is the meditation and the sleep quality is what we're measuring for change there. Okay, and again, just showing you the different ways we can operationalize those variables. So meditation can be operationalized as doing 30 minutes of meditation a day for 3 weeks, or we could operationalize that as doing 1 hour sessions of meditation for 3 times a week for 1 month. So again, the way we're measuring that, the numbers we're using, the descriptive ways we're measuring that, that's what operationalizing means. Okay, so I'm not going to go too into depth with that. This is an example of a hypothesis there. So again, the green one is the population. The red one is the simple IV. The simple DV is your blue. Your operationalizing of the variables is in the purple in the brackets. So I put them in the brackets, but you don't have to put them in brackets if you don't want to. And then compared to the underlined part is talking about our control group. Okay. So again, as long as we follow that formula of iPod C for control group at the end, there's really no way you can get the answer wrong or not write a proper hypothesis there. Okay. Okay, that brings us to the end of 1A. So now I'm just going to share screen another PowerPoint that I would like us to go through now, just to apply our knowledge before I let you go to start your work for 1A. So I think I should have shared the screen now. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do is this PowerPoint has 5 scenarios. I'll put it up on Schoolbox as well. And all we're going to do is we're going to go through maybe two scenarios, and then we're going to work on them together. And then I'm going to let you do the remaining 3 scenarios by yourself and put that up on due work or email that to me so I can check it. Okay, so I know that you guys know what you're doing. So let's get started with the first scenario. The first scenario says, a researcher will randomly allocate 50 Year 6 students to one of 2 groups. Group 1 will receive praise by their teacher for correctly spelling words given for homework. Group 2 will not receive praise. The researcher will then measure the number of words correctly spelled by each group. So in the chat box now, just looking at the scenario, I want you guys to write down what you think the IV of this scenario is, the IV and DV. So let's go for the simple IV DV. If you know how it's been operationalized, put that information in as well. But yeah, just go ahead and think about now what the IV DV is and put it in the chat box. Okay, so some of you have given me some answers there. Now, you have to remember, guys, there's a few clues in this scenario about what the IV and the DV are, okay? Number one, we always know that the control group of a study is the group that's not exposed to the IV, they're just used for comparison. So in here, it says group 2 will not receive praise. In other words, they're not receiving the IV. So that should give you an idea that the IV was actually the amount of praise received. Okay, so that we'll write that down here. Make that a bit smaller. So praise. Oops. Oh my God, everything just froze. Hold on. Okay, let's do that again. Yeah. So amount, or let's make it more specific, whether or not praise was received. Okay, that's probably the best way to do it, whether praise was received. Okay. And again, I told you that the reason it's praise, why praise is the IV, is because you can easily see that group 2, which is our control group, is not going to receive praise. Okay, because they're not receiving praise, that shows that praise is the IV, because group 1 is receiving praise. Okay, so what we're then measuring, and I told you guys that the variable that is measured is the DV. So that's obviously saying here, the researcher will then measure the number of words correctly spelled by each group. So because we're measuring the DV would then be number of correctly spelled words. Okay, so that's going to be our DV there. Okay, oh, you know what? Number of correctly spelled words is, you know, kind of operationalizing. And we could even just be more general. We could even just say, you know, spelling ability. Yeah, or ability to spell or capacity to spell, any of that would be fine. Okay, so that's going to be our simple IV and our simple DV. Does that make sense so far? Like, is there any questions? Just put it in the chat box if you're confused and I'll explain it a little more. So then we go into looking at our operationalized IV and DV now. So operationalized means how it's measured. Okay, so operationalize, look at the study and think about how is praise being measured. There's no specific way actually. You would simply just say whether or not the teacher gives praise, because the teacher is the one giving the praise. They're not a parent, not another person. So all we're going to do is add that information in. There's no extra quantity information. Whether the teacher gives praise to the students. That's about it. And then obviously with the operationalized DV, all we're going to write here is how spelling ability was seen. So it specifically says the researcher will then measure the number of words correctly spelled by each group. So all we're going to write here is number of words correctly spelled by each group. That's it. Okay, sometimes it's easy. Sometimes all we have to do is take the information directly from the scenario and then just put it in. So far with the IV, DV, is there any confusion there? Can you guys understand the little clues that were given in that scenario to help you understand what the IV and DV are? It's really important for us to always remember that we have to look at what is the cause factor in that particular study and what is the effect. So what are we manipulating? And then what are we measuring for change? In this case, we were measuring the spelling words for change to see if this kid spell the words any better, if they get praised. And the praise is the variable we're controlling. So the teacher praises one group, which is group 1, and doesn't praise group 2. Okay, so because one group is getting the IV and that's the experimental group, and one group is not getting the IV and that's the control group, it's clear that praise is going to be our IV for this example. Okay, so I want you guys now to think about and put in the chat box, just write a single sentence writing what the aim of the study is. Okay, and I'm going to help you to start it off. So we can start it off by saying to investigate the effect of blah, blah, blah. So, or to determine the effect of, to investigate the effect of, and remember our formula was IV on DV. That's it. Okay. So just use that formula now to write your own aim. And put it in the chat box and then we can have a look.
Miss what's Nabil told me to tell you that his laptop keeps shutting down.
Yeah, I know. He keeps coming in and out. That's okay. Just if he's having issues, just tell him that anyway, I'm going to put the recording up. It's all good. He can just listen to it or see the part he missed later on. Okay, so when we're talking about the aim, so to investigate the effect of IV and on the DV, so we know what the IV and DV are, so all we do is just plug that information in. So we're looking at the effect of praise. That would be a simple aim. That would be fine. Yep, Zoya, that's a good aim as well. Again, with the aim, you don't have to get too complicated about it as well, guys. You just have to keep it simple. You don't have to operationalize the IV and DV in the aim. You just have to give the simple IV and simple DV there. But yeah, that's good. So that's going to be our aim of the study. Okay. So going on to the next part, which is probably the most tricky part, the most tricky aspect of it. Now we're looking at the research hypothesis. So we have to remember our memory tip. I'm going to write it down again, iPod C, to remember what to include in the research hypothesis. So now using your information, you've got the IV, you've got the DV, you know what the control group is or what they're not getting in terms of they're not getting the IV. The only thing we need to identify here is the population now. If we read through our scenario, we can see that the population are grade 6 students. So you can mention that in your answer. So grade 6 students or even just students in general, that both of those would be correct. You can say year 6 students because it's specifically given that information. The one thing I do not want you guys to do though is to write this number, okay? There should be no number in your hypothesis, just that bit there, okay? Because when we write the number, that's going to be a sample rather than a population. So I'm just crossing out the number there for now to remind you. All right, so guys, I'm going to give you like maybe 2 minutes to actually write a research hypothesis. And if you want, you can send it to me in the chat box as well, and I can have a look. And we start with our 4 magic words. Again, I don't know why I keep calling them the magic words. They are not magical. They have no magical properties, but it's just sounds good when you say it. It was hypothesized that blah, blah, blah. So then that's getting you started there. So finish off that sentence now using our formula. Yep, Safa, that's a really good hypothesis. Good work. Yep, that's a good hypothesis as well, Yazid. Good work. Yep, that's a good hypothesis as well, Samuel. Great work there. Alrighty, so I think what we'll do is we'll just write it. And again, guys, with hypotheses, just like two people will not write the same English essay or the same paragraph, hypotheses are very subjective. So depending on the way that you word your things, depending on how you use grammatical expression, how you write sentences, we can't say that there's just one answer for a hypothesis, okay? So again, people could be using different ways. A few things I have to mention though is number one, regardless of your grammatical expression, a hypothesis always needs to be in kind of like a single sentence, if that makes sense. So you don't want to have full stops and commas, full stops in between. You don't want it to be multiple sentences. It's going to be a long single sentence, obviously. But again, it needs to be a single sentence within one cohesive, unified paragraph, if that makes sense. Okay, it's got to be a single sentence or like a single paragraph. Okay, so literally no full stops in between. It shouldn't read like a story. It should just read like a single, no full stops in between. Okay. Also, it should start with, it was hypothesized that. One word that should be forbidden is it was proven. Okay, this is forbidden. I say it's forbidden because we never prove things in psychology. We can only hypothesize. Okay, hypothesize means we can only predict. Even when we get our results and our results support our hypothesis, we can never say that our results have proven something. Okay, we can say our results have supported the hypothesis, but nothing is ever proven because we can just go back and do another study and you know, find different results. So anyways, I'm going to stop talking now and I'm going to actually write a sample answer. So what we can say is, I'll use color black. Okay, it was hypothesized that year 6 students, so that's our population, who receive praise as being praised by their teacher will have better, or you could even say increased spelling ability by by having more correctly spelled words compared to year 6 students who did not receive praise. Again, it doesn't have to be word to word as what I've written, but as long as you've got those basic ideas in your hypothesis, then that would be correct there. Okay, so year 6 students is our population. Receiving praise is our IV. What I've put in the brackets there is the operationalized IV. We'll have better or increased spelling ability is our DV. And note that I've written better or increased. So I've mentioned what the trend is. Okay, you always need to mention what the direction of effect or trend is. So is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? What's happening? You need to mention a descriptive word there. Okay, so those of you who do health and human, a lot of the time when you analyze data, for example, you always mention whether it's increasing or decreasing. Okay, so similarly, when we write a hypothesis, we always have to mention that direction of effect. Okay, what's in the brackets here is the operationalized DV. So by having more correctly spelled words, compared to year 6 students who did not means that they're the control group. So I've mentioned everything in my iPod C, and that would get me the full 3 marks there. And a lot of you who sent me in the chat box as well, you would get the 3 marks as well there. Okay, a question in the conclusion when you mentioned that the results has proven, no. So don't use the word proven at all, just remove it from your memory, okay? Don't use the word proven at all with research methods because nothing is proven, okay? That's something that, you know, when we've gone to PDs and things and, you know, from a research methods point of view, it doesn't make sense to ever use the word proven as well, okay? Because nothing is ever set in stone. So you might do a study and you might get a set of results and I might go and do a study and I might say, well, your results are invalid now, okay? So you haven't really proven anything. That's why we don't use the word prove. Okay, so that's basically scenario 1. So we're going to move on to the next scenario now and then we'll end it there. A sleep researcher is concerned about the safety consequences when public transport drivers are sleep deprived. He plans to conduct an experiment to test the effects of amount of sleep on tram drivers' reaction time. One group of tram drivers will be allowed to go to sleep at a normal time and will be awakened at 7 a.m. A second group will be kept awake until 3 a.m., allowed to go to sleep, then awakened at 7 a.m. So you can see that there are two clear groups here. One of them will be the experiment, one of them will be the control. Both groups will then undertake a computer-assisted reaction time test every 2 hours during the 8-hour period after awakening. Mean test scores will be calculated for each group so that a comparison can be made. So automatically we can see that this, at first glance, appears to be a more confusing scenario than the previous one. It isn't actually, it just got more words to make you feel intimidated there, but it's actually quite simple, okay? So now we have to determine what is the IV, what are we manipulating or what are we making the experiments do, and what's the DV? So what aspect of the participants are we measuring in terms of behavior, in terms of ability to do something for change? Okay, so I'm gonna give you guys like a few seconds now just to go through the scenario again and write down what you think the IV and DV are in the chat box. I'm going to just underline a key part of the scenario that gives you a lot of that information. Yep, excellent. Samia, Zoya, Safa, that's excellent. You've got it right. That's all good. Yeah. So guys, the IV is obviously going to be amount of sleep. That's what we're manipulating, because you can see that for the first group, the experiment is letting them sleep at a normal time. And then for the other group, they're not going to be allowed to sleep until 3 a.m. Then they're only going to be able to sleep for 4 hours before being woken up at 7 a.m. again. Okay, so obviously there's a clear sleep deprivation group and a clear group that has normal sleep. Okay, the sleep deprivation group, which is our second group, they will form our experimental group. And the control group will be the group that's not being sleep deprived. That will be the first group there, okay? So what we can write here now is we can say amount of sleep achieved. You don't even need to write achieved, amount of sleep is enough. Okay, and that's the independent variable. Now the operationalized variable is going to be, the operationalized IV is going to be how we're measuring that for change. So this is where we include the numbers, okay? So what we're going to say is whether you sleep at a normal time, whether you have a normal sleep time or are kept awake until 3 a.m. 4 hours of sleep. I've just got the 4 hours by literally just looking at how long they can sleep. So they're allowed to sleep till, they're allowed to go to sleep at 3 a.m. and then wake up at 7 a.m. Okay. You could even just write that information there. You could write, or only allowed to sleep from 3 a.m. I'll put that in, or only. Okay, either way, it's correct. Okay, so that's going to be our operationalized IV there. So I'll just make that a bit thing so that it's not in the way. Okay, now we're looking at the operationalized DV. Okay, and the operationalized DV is going to be obviously what we're measuring for change. So all of you guys, or most of you guys, said in the chat that it's reaction time. That's correct. Okay, so reaction time is basically our DV. Very important if you're a person driving a bus or a train. If something pops up in front of you, you need to be able to react in time. So that's obviously probably why they're measuring that variable there. Now, how are we operationalizing the DV? So obviously, I think that groups have to undertake a computer-assisted reaction time test, and then the mean test scores will be calculated from that, okay? So all we're gonna write here is mean test scores from the computer-assisted reaction time test. You could even say taken every 2 hours, blah, blah, blah. I'm literally just copying the information from the slide, from the scenario. That's it. Okay. Again, if the scenario gives us that information, you don't want to waste it. Just use it, because if that information is already given to you, all that's left to do is just copy that in. Okay. So that's going to be our operationalized DV, simply taken from the scenario. I haven't done anything to that now. Okay, aim of the study. So I want you guys now using our formula. So our formula was starting with the words to investigate the effect of IV on DV. I want you to now write the aim of this study, what you think the aim could be. It's obviously going to be different for every person depending on how you structure the sentence, but it should be more or less the same idea. So write that now in your book or in the chat box, and then I'll write a sample answer for you. Yep, excellent, Nabil. That's correct. Good work. Okay. So how we would start it is we would say to yep, that's correct, Samuel. Good work. So now what we would write is, before we start with the hypothesis, we'll just write our aim. So to investigate the effect of the IV, which was the amount of sleep received. Okay, and remember before I said there are many ways that this could be worded differently, but still be the same, still be the correct answer. So you could even say effect of sleep achieved on the reaction time of a tram drive. So it's literally the same variables we're talking about, but I'm just using different words, but both of those are still correct answers. Okay, so again, showing you that the way you word things out in terms of grammar can also affect your aim, can affect your answer there, but it will not mean that you get it wrong. But don't always think of everything as having to be word to word. Okay, especially when you're looking through things like solution booklets and stuff, your answer could still be correct as long as it meets the key criteria. Okay, coming to the last thing for today is our research hypothesis. So basically, guys, we're going to start with our 4 magic words. It was hypothesized that. And now I want you to fill in that information now. So it was hypothesized that using our memory tip iPod C. Okay, iPod C, and getting the information from the scenario there. So write your hypothesis in the chat box if you haven't already. Okay, so I'm just going to put a hypothesis here. Oops, maybe start it here. So yeah, we start with our forwards. It was hypothesized that. And then we need to mention the control group. Okay, oh, sorry, not control group. We need to mention the population. So our population is public transport drivers. So it was hypothesized that public transport drivers who are sleep deprived or who do not, how could we write this? Who sleep. And how long does it say? One group, normal. Yep. Oops, sorry, it's going the other way. Will have increased reaction time. So not increased, reaction time would be, your reaction time would have to decrease with decreased, because the less your reaction time is, the better it is. Yeah, we'll have decreased reaction time as measured by mean test scores. And a reaction time test compared to public transport drivers who do not have normal sleep. Oh, can I fit it in? Okay, somehow fit it in there. Okay, so that's basically, again, just showing you the population, normal amount of sleep, or sleep is the IV. You've got your DV, which is the reaction time. You've operationalized it in the brackets, and then compared to public transport drivers who do not have normal sleep or who have sleep deprivation and they only sleep for 4 hours, that's our control group there. So again, you could have used different words. I could probably make this even more lengthy, but I don't have space. So Zoom has actually stopped me right there. So yeah, that's still okay. Okay, as long as you've written something along those lines, you can get the mark. Again, the mistake that most people make is that they don't write what the actual DV is, or they write that, but they don't mention the direction of effect. So you need to write something like decreased or reduced or decline. You need to mention the control group, the compared to part, and you also need to operationalize the variables there, okay, based on the information given in the scenario. Okay, guys, so we're able to finish exactly on time. That's good. So what I'm going to get you to do for the rest of the period is, just give me 1 second. I'll quickly scribble this all out and I'll show you what I want you to do. So for next period, your main work is to finish off 1A questions on EdRollo. And more importantly, because we're already in the getting into the role of, doing this scenario, I want you to finish off the remaining 3 scenarios, so scenario 3, 4, and 5 on your own. And I want you to email that to me. Oh, no, you know what? I'll put a due work box on the class page and you can upload it to the due work box. And then I'll mark that and I'll let you know how you go. Okay, so that's basically what I want you to do for the rest of the class until recess time. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording here.